At 12:47 p.m., December 18th, 1944, Corporal Esteban Valdez, Philippine Commonwealth Army Guerrilla Detachment, crouched behind a limestone outcrop 70 meters from Carigara Bay's eastern shore, watching 18 Japanese Marines in 3 motorized landing craft angle toward the beach, engines growling through humid air thick with the smell of rotting seaweed. Strapped across his back was something his commanding officer had called a suicide device masquerading as innovation. A bamboo tube packed with dynamite charges, fitted with a crude percussion cap trigger mechanism, and loaded with a salvaged 75mm artillery shell as its projectile. The lead boat, a Daihatsu-class landing craft bristling with Type 96 machine guns, shone cut through swells 200 meters offshore, closing at 8 knots. In 90 seconds, maybe less, those Marines would establish a beachhead position that command had deemed strategically unassailable without air support that wouldn't arrive for 3 days, if at all. But Esteban Valdez had built his reputation on making the impossible look routine, proving that genius doesn't require a West Point ring, just calloused hands and a willingness to reimagine what weapons can be. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. She asked the technique had a name among the guerrillas who'd seen it demonstrated on pig carcasses and abandoned fishing boats. Putok ng Anghel, the Angel's Blast. Officers called it reckless. Esteban called it mathematics. The landing craft's bow ramp began lowering before the keel scraped sand. Esteban pressed his shoulder against the bamboo launcher, feeling the weight of the artillery shell settle inside the tube. His spotter, Private Luis Mercado, lay flat beside him, with a stopwatch salvaged from a dead Japanese naval officer, counting down approach vectors like he was timing a bullfight instead of an amphibious assault. 65 meters, Luis whispered. They're deploying in staggered formation. You'll only get one clear shot before they scatter. The improvised weapon weighed 19 pounds. Yeah, most of it concentrated in the warhead. A 75mm high-explosive shell Esteban had personally extracted from a wrecked American M8 howitzer motor carriage discovered half buried in a rice paddy 3 weeks earlier. The shell's copper driving band had been filed down to fit the bamboo tube's interior diameter. The propellant came from 8 sticks of TNT borrowed from a U.S. Army engineering cache, wrapped in oilcloth and tamped behind the projectile with newspaper padding. The firing mechanism was pure improvisation. A spring-loaded carpenter's nail, positioned against a match head, held in place by a trigger carved from hardwood and fishing line. Pull the cord, the nail strikes the match ignites the TNT, and the TNT launches the shell with roughly, Esteban had calculated this on paper scraps using pre-war artillery tables, 1,200 feet per second of muzzle velocity. Roughly. The mathematics assumed the bamboo wouldn't explode in his face. 50 meters, Luis said. Through the crude iron sight welded to the launcher's forward end, Esteban tracked the lead boat's starboard hull. Japanese Marines were already standing. Type 38 rifles held high to keep them dry. An officer in the bow shouted orders Esteban couldn't hear over the engine noise and surf crash. His finger touched the trigger cord. "Wait," Luis hissed. "Let them commit to the beach. If you miss high, the shell goes into the jungle. If you miss low, it skips off the water. You need them grounded, static, not bunched up." "I know. Just making sure you know. I've known since I built this thing. The landing craft's ramp hit sand with a metallic clang that carried across the beach. Marines began disembarking, weapons ready, moving with the disciplined efficiency of troops who'd conducted 100 such landings. The second boat angled toward a position 30 meters north. The third circled, providing covering fire support. Esteban adjusted his aim 3 degrees right, compensating for a crosswind he could feel but not measure. "Now," Luis said. Esteban pulled the trigger cord. Name: Esteban Reyes Valdez. Age: 28 years old. Rank: Corporal. Philippine Commonwealth Army. Attached to the 8th Guerrilla Regiment. Leyte Sector. Nationality: Filipino. Born in Tacloban City. Educated through secondary school before the occupation specialty, ordnance disposal, and improvised weapons fabrication. A specialty that didn't officially exist in any Army manual, but had become essential in a war fought with salvaged equipment and captured supplies. Before the war, Esteban had worked as a machinist's apprentice in his uncle's metalworking shop, fabricating agricultural equipment and repairing fishing boat engines. He understood torque, compression ratios, and metallurgical stress points the way some men understood scripture. When the Japanese invaded in 1942, he'd enlisted with romantic notions of conventional warfare, neat formations, supply lines, actual ammunition. Reality delivered something different. By late 1944, the guerrilla units operating in Leyte's interior fought with whatever they could steal, salvage, found, or improvise. American supply drops were irregular, at best. Captured Japanese equipment often used different caliber ammunition. Standard infantry tactics assumed resources that simply didn't exist in the jungle. Esteban adapted by becoming what his commanding officer, Captain Rodrigo Salazar, called disturbingly creative with explosives. He'd built grenades from condensed milk cans packed with black powder and scrap metal. He'd converted Japanese Type 89 grenade launchers to fire homemade projectiles. He'd once destroyed a Japanese ammunition depot using a catapult constructed from truck springs and coconut timber. The launcher, the Angel's Blast, represented his most ambitious project. The concept had emerged from a practical problem. Japanese landing craft operated with impunity along Leyte's coastline, solid landing reinforcement, troops, and supplies, while guerrilla forces watched helplessly from cover. Standard infantry weapons couldn't penetrate the boat's armored hulls. The guerrillas possessed no anti-tank weapons, no artillery, no naval support. But they did have salvaged artillery shells and bamboo, and Esteban's understanding that a tube, a projectile, and sufficient propellant could approximate a recoilless rifle if properly engineered. The officer's response had been predictably dismissive. "You want to build a what?" Captain Salazar had asked when Esteban presented his sketches. "A single-shot, disposable rocket launcher. Well, not technically a rocket. More of a smoothbore mortar that fires horizontally, using bamboo. Reinforced bamboo, with steel bands. The principle is identical to a naval signal cannon. He just scaled up. Valdez, bamboo explodes when you put that kind of pressure inside it. Not if you select the right species. Bambusa blumiana has a compressive strength of approximately 8,000 PSY when properly treated. The propellant charge generates roughly 6,000 PSY at ignition. The safety margin is sufficient." Salazar had stared at him like he'd suggested they defeat the Japanese by asking politely, "And if your calculations are wrong, then I'll be too dead to apologize, sir." That's not reassuring. It's honest. The captain had denied approval for field testing, ordered Esteban to focus on practical contributions, like maintaining existing weapons, suggested that inventing new ways to die wasn't helping the war effort. Esteban had built the launcher anyway. Show us working nights in a concealed workshop dug into a hillside cave, using tools he'd fabricated from scrap metal and mathematics he'd memorized from pre-war engineering texts. He'd tested the firing mechanism on progressively larger charges, measuring backblast, recoil force, and barrel integrity. He'd calculated optimal projectile weight, propellant loads, and firing angles. The first live test, conducted secretly with Luis as his only witness, had destroyed the target, a beached Japanese patrol boat, and convinced Esteban the weapon was viable. The second test had nearly killed him when a firing pin malfunction caused a hang fire that detonated 3 seconds late. By the third test, he'd refined the design to something approaching reliability. Approaching being the operative word. None of this impressed Captain Salazar, who'd discovered the unauthorized weapons program when a patrol stumbled across Esteban's workshop. The resulting disciplinary meeting had been brief and hostile. You disobeyed direct orders. I pursued tactical innovation outside normal command channels, sir. That's a creative way to say insubordination. With respect, Captain, insubordination implies I endangered the unit. I endangered only myself. And what happens when that thing explodes and kills everyone within 30 meters? Then you'll have been correct, sir, and I'll be too dead to dispute the point. Salazar had assigned him to perimeter guard duty, punishment detail far from anything important. But he'd allowed Esteban to keep the launcher, perhaps recognizing that destroying it would only trigger construction of a replacement. That had been 4 days ago. Now, crouched behind a limestone outcrop, with Japanese Marines establishing a beachhead position that command had deemed unassailable, Esteban prepared to demonstrate that tactical innovation mattered more than institutional approval. He pulled the trigger cord. Location: Leyte Island, Eastern Visayas, Philippines. Date: December 1944. Operational context: the Americans had returned, but liberation was proving more complicated than the newsreel suggested. General MacArthur had waited ashore at Leyte Gulf in October with photographers and promises. I have returned, he'd announced, and the propaganda value was immeasurable. But propaganda couldn't fight the 80,000 Japanese troops defending the island with suicidal determination. The Battle of Leyte had devolved into a grinding infantry nightmare. Japanese forces, commanded by General Sosaku Suzuki, had retreated into the island's mountainous interior, conducting a defensive campaign designed to bleed American forces while buying time for reinforcements. The terrain, dense jungle, steep ridges, endless rain, favored defenders. Every valley became a killing ground. Every ridgeline required air support, the weather frequently grounded. American casualties mounted daily. Supply lines stretched thin. Progress measured in yards, not miles. The guerrilla units, officially recognized by American command, operated in the gaps between conventional forces, raiding supply lines, ambushing patrols, denying the Japanese control of coastline and interior passages. But recognition didn't translate to equipment. The guerrillas fought with captured weapons, homemade explosives, and desperation. As Captain Salazar's unit, the 8th Guerrilla Regiment, controlled approximately 40 square kilometers of Leyte's northeastern coast, a strategically valuable stretch that included several deep-water anchorages the Japanese used for nighttime resupply operations. American planners wanted those anchorages secured. American combat units had more pressing concerns elsewhere. So the guerrillas got the mission and minimal support. The Japanese, understanding the anchorage's value, had begun landing reinforcement troops in company-strength detachments, establishing fortified beachhead positions that could interdict guerrilla movements and protect the supply operations. Standard amphibious assault doctrine. Land Marines, establish perimeter, expand control. The guerrillas couldn't stop them. Standard infantry weapons, bolt-action rifles, captured machine guns, homemade grenades, couldn't penetrate the landing craft's armored hulls. The boats simply beached, deployed troops behind covering fire, and established positions before the guerrillas could mount effective resistance. By the time guerrilla fighters closed to grenade range, the Japanese had already dug in. Command's proposed solution involved coordinating a multi-unit assault with American artillery support. The plan required 3 days to organize. The Japanese were landing reinforcements nightly. "We're losing the coast," Captain Salazar had told his officers during the previous evening's briefing. "They're establishing strongpoints faster than we can contest them. In a week, maybe 2, they'll have enough troops to push us back into the highlands. Then we're just another nuisance, yet not a strategic asset." "What about American support?" someone asked. "Requested, pending, expected sometime between tomorrow and never." Salazar had spread a hand-drawn map across the makeshift table. "We've got guerrillas. We've got jungle. We've got improvised weapons that work maybe 70% of the time. The Japanese have armored boats, trained Marines, and functional supply chains. So what's the plan? Harass them, slow them down. Hope the Americans show up before we're extinct." It wasn't inspiring leadership, but it was honest. Esteban had studied the map in silence, calculating angles and distances, thinking about bamboo tubes and artillery shells, and whether mathematical principles could substitute for institutional resources. The other officers had discussed ambush positions and fallback routes. Esteban had thought about muzzle velocity and impact angles, and how much TNT was required to launch a 75mm projectile across 200 meters of open water. After the briefing, he'd approached Captain Salazar privately. "Sir, I have a tactical proposal. Does it involve that bamboo suicide device?" "It involves addressing the landing craft problem directly, sir. The landing craft problem requires artillery or air support, or a shoulder-fired weapon with sufficient penetrating power to disable armored vessels at ranges exceeding 200 meters. Salazar had looked at him with the expression usually reserved for men proposing surrender or desertion. "You're serious?" "Completely, sir." "Your bamboo launcher can't possibly—" "It can, sir. I've tested it. The mathematics are sound. And a 75mm high-explosive shell delivers more than adequate stopping power against Daihatsu-class landing craft. The challenge is accuracy, but at static targets under 200 meters, the error margin is acceptable." "Acceptable meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning I'll probably hit something important." "Probably." "Nothing in warfare is certain, sir. But I can offer better odds than waiting for American artillery that might not arrive." The captain had been silent for a long moment, studying the map, calculating risks against vanishing alternatives. "If you miss, they establish their beachhead position. If I don't try, they establish it anyway, sir. If that launcher explodes, you die. If the Japanese secure the coast, we all die. Mine's just faster." Salazar had finally nodded. He had the gesture of a man accepting terrible options because they're marginally better than catastrophic ones. "You get one shot, Valdez. One. If it fails, you retreat immediately. No heroic last stands. Understand?" "Understood, sir." "And Valdez, If you die, I'm putting in your official record that you disobeyed orders. Can't have the Americans thinking we encourage this kind of recklessness. Appreciated, sir. Now, 70 meters from catastrophic failure or vindication, Esteban prepared to discover which official record he'd earned. The Japanese landing pattern followed predictable doctrine. 3 boats in staggered approach. Lead vessel beaches first, while the others provide covering fire. Marines deploy in defensive semicircle before advancing inland. Now, Esteban had watched the same pattern executed flawlessly the previous night when a Japanese detachment had landed 4 kilometers south. The guerrillas had harassed them with sniper fire and retreated. By dawn, the Japanese had constructed fortifications that would require significant casualties to overcome. Tonight would be different. Tonight, Esteban had positioned himself and Luis at a limestone outcrop, commanding clear sight lines to the primary landing beach. The position offered excellent cover, multiple retreat routes, and approximately 70 meters of standoff distance, close enough for accuracy, far enough to survive the backblast. Probably far enough. The launcher rested against his shoulder. 19 pounds of improvised engineering that represented 3 weeks of clandestine fabrication. The bamboo tube measured 6 feet long and 4 inches in interior diameter, reinforced with steel bands scavenged from destroyed artillery pieces. The firing mechanism, a spring-loaded nail striker triggered by fishing line, seemed almost comically simple given the destruction it would unleash. If the mathematics held, if the bamboo didn't rupture, if the propellant charge was correctly calculated, if the percussion cap ignited reliably, if the artillery shell actually flew true instead of tumbling. Too many variables, too many potential failures. Luis pressed binoculars against his eyes, tracking the lead boat's approach. "They're slowing," he whispered. "Preparing to beach. Maybe 40 seconds. The jungle around them hummed with nocturnal insects, indifferent to human violence. Somewhere in the darkness behind their position, and the rest of Captain Salazar's unit waited in concealment, ready to exploit whatever chaos Esteban created, or to cover his retreat when everything failed spectacularly. No pressure. 30 seconds. Esteban adjusted the launcher's angle, compensating for the boat's decreasing speed. The crude iron sight, welded from a nail, bent into a crude U-shape, wobbled slightly. He steadied his breathing, forcing his heart rate down through conscious effort, remembering what his uncle had taught him about machinists' work. Measure twice, cut once, and never rush precision. This was just precision metal working with explosives, and lives depending on accuracy, and institutional vindication hanging in the balance. 20 seconds. They're almost grounded. The lead boat's bow touched sand, with a grinding scrape audible across the beach. The ramp began lowering. Japanese Marines surged forward, weapons ready, moving with combat efficiency that came from doing this dozens of times. 15 seconds. Esteban's finger touched the trigger cord, a length of fishing line wrapped around a hardwood toggle. Pull the toggle. The tension releases the spring. The nail strikes the match head. The match ignites the TNT, and the laws of physics take over. Unless something broke, unless the mathematics were wrong, unless he'd miscalculated compression ratios or propellant burn rates or any of the 100 variables that separated controlled explosion from catastrophic failure. 10 seconds. They're deploying. Through the iron sight, Esteban tracked the boat's waterline, aiming for the junction between hull and ramp where the armor was thinnest. The 75mm shell, if it flew true, would penetrate the hull approximately 18 inches above the waterline, detonating inside the crew compartment with enough force to catastrophically compromise structural integrity, if it flew true. 5 seconds. The boat was grounded now. Stationary, Marines fanning out across the beach. The perfect target. Immobile, vulnerable, packed with troops and fuel. Now, Luis whispered. Esteban pulled the trigger cord. The spring released with a metallic snap. The carpenter's nail struck the match head with precision. The match ignited with a brief flare of phosphorus heat. Then nothing happened. For one terrible heartbeat, Esteban thought he'd experienced a dud. The match failed to ignite the propellant. The charge was inert. The entire weapon was just 19 pounds of useless bamboo and humiliation. Then the TNT detonated. Around the explosion was simultaneous fire and thunder. A physical shockwave that slammed through Esteban's body like a truck hitting a wall. The bamboo tube screamed. There was no other word for the sound it made. A shriek of stressed material pushed beyond design tolerances. And the artillery shell launched with velocities that defied the weapon's improvised construction. The backblast was a dragon's breath of superheated gas and burning propellant that scorched the air behind the launcher. Esteban had positioned himself correctly, angled away from the primary blast direction, but the heat still felt like someone had opened a furnace door directly behind his head. The shell cleared the muzzle in a streak of smoke and velocity, tumbling slightly. The rifling grooves were non-existent, so the projectile flew ballistic, inherently unstable. It held on target by initial trajectory alone. It covered 70 meters in less than a tenth of a second, moving fast enough that the human eye registered only a blur. It hit the landing craft 2 feet below the waterline, exactly where Esteban had aimed. The impact explosion was catastrophic. The 75mm high-explosive shell, designed to destroy fortifications and penetrate armor, found a target with approximately 1 inch of steel plating and hollow interior spaces packed with fuel, ammunition, and human bodies. The warhead detonated on contact, converting the boat's crew compartment into a blast chamber. The hull ruptured outward in 6 directions simultaneously. The fuel tanks ignited a microsecond later. The ammunition stores, beamless, grenades, and machine gun belts began cooking off in sympathetic detonations that turned the landing craft into a fireworks display of lethal fragments. The Marines who'd already disembarked were thrown forward by the shockwave. The Marines, still inside the boat, simply ceased to exist in any form, recognizable as human. The officer in the bow, visible for a split second before the explosion, vanished into the fireball. The sound reached Esteban as a layered boom. The initial shell detonation, the fuel ignition, and then the rolling crescendo of secondary explosions as munitions cooked off. The blast echoed across the beach and into the jungle, a thunder that announced catastrophic violence to anyone within a kilometer. The second Japanese landing craft, approximately 30 meters north of the first, shot and immediately reversed engines and began backing away from shore. Its crew had watched their lead boat transform from a functional vessel into a flaming wreck in under 2 seconds. They wanted no part of whatever had caused that. The third boat, providing offshore covering fire, also began reversing. Luis was screaming something, but Esteban couldn't hear through the ringing in his ears. The backblast had been louder than anticipated. His shoulder felt bruised where the launcher had recoiled, more recoil than calculated, suggesting the propellant load had been slightly excessive. The bamboo tube was still intact. Esteban checked this immediately. running hands along the reinforcement bands, searching for cracks or ruptures. The interior would be charred, possibly warped from the heat, but the structure held. The weapon had survived its own firing, which meant it could be reloaded. Except reloading required several minutes, fresh propellant charges he didn't have, and a second artillery shell he hadn't brought because he'd expected one shot followed by immediate retreat. Luis grabbed his shoulder, shaking him, pointing toward the beach. The surviving Japanese Marines, approximately 14, by Esteban's rapid count, were scrambling for cover, no longer a disciplined landing force, but individuals desperate to escape whatever had just destroyed their boat. Some ran toward the jungle. Others dove behind the wreckage of their own vessel. Two lay motionless on the sand, killed by blast fragments. The burning landing craft lit the beach like a bonfire, destroying any darkness the Japanese might have used for concealment. Behind Esteban's position, Captain Salazar's guerrillas opened fire. The ambush was perfectly executed. Automatic weapons, rifles, grenades, all directed at Japanese troops caught in the open, with their cover destroyed, and their extraction vehicles fleeing. The engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds before the surviving Marines attempted surrender. Then silence, broken only by the crackling of burning metal and the pop of cooking ammunition. Luis was still shaking him. "That worked," Luis said, voice hoarse. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, that actually worked." Esteban set down the launcher, hands trembling from adrenaline, and the physical shock of firing a weapon that probably shouldn't have existed outside theoretical sketches. His ears rang, his shoulder throbbed, his mouth tasted like copper and smoke. But the landing craft was destroyed. The beachhead was denied. At the mathematics had held. "Reload," Esteban said. "What?" "We need to reload. They'll send more boats." "Valdez, you don't have ammunition." "Then we retrieve ammunition. The wreck probably has unexploded ordnance. Or we use the launcher as a club." "I don't know." "I'm improvising." Luis stared at him, like he'd suggested they attack the Japanese mainland. "You just blew up a landing craft with a bamboo tube and dynamite. Maybe take a moment to appreciate that you're not dead." "I'll appreciate it after we win the engagement." Captain Salazar appeared from the jungle, moving fast, rifle in hand. He looked at the burning wreck, then at Esteban, then at the launcher, then back at the wreck. "Report," he said. "Direct hit, sir. Hull penetration. Catastrophic secondary explosions. Surviving Marines neutralized by supporting fire." Senor, 2 enemy vessels retreated. Beach secured. Salazar stared at him for a long moment. "You built a functional anti-boat weapon out of bamboo." "Yes, sir." "It actually works." "Apparently, sir." "And you're not dead?" "Not currently, sir." The captain looked at the launcher again, studying it with the expression of someone reevaluating fundamental assumptions about reality. "How many more of these can you build?" "With proper materials and time? Maybe a dozen per week, sir. They're single-shot weapons, effectively disposable, but the fabrication process is straightforward once you understand the principles." "And they're reliable?" "That's the first field test, sir. I can't guarantee reliability without more data." "It destroyed a landing craft." "Yes, sir." "In one shot." "Yes, sir." "Valdez, and I'm going to need you to stop being technically correct and admit this is extraordinary. It's applied physics, sir, not magic." Salazar laughed, the sound edged with exhaustion and disbelief and something approaching respect. "Applied physics that just saved our position." "How long to fabricate the next launcher?" 2 days, sir. Possibly 3 if I need to source more bamboo." "You've got 36 hours. And Valdez?" "Sir?" "I'm writing a commendation, official record. Americans can complain about unorthodox tactics, but they can't complain about results. Appreciated, sir. The captain moved toward the beach, already organizing salvage operations and perimeter security. Luis clapped Esteban's shoulder. "You're certifiably insane," he said. "Maybe," Esteban replied.
But I'm also correct.
On word spread through the guerrilla network with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By dawn, every unit operating in Leyte's northern sector knew that Corporal Esteban Valdez had destroyed a Japanese landing craft using a homemade weapon built from bamboo and salvaged artillery shells. The story mutated with each retelling, acquiring embellishments. The launcher was actually made from steel. No, wait. It was pure bamboo, held together by prayer and desperation. Esteban had destroyed 3 boats. No, 5 boats. He'd killed an entire company of Marines. He'd done it while under machine gun fire. He'd done it one-handed while eating rice. The truth, 1 boat, 1 shot, 70 meters, proper cover, was spectacular enough without enhancement. But legend requires embellishment. Should American liaison officers arrived 3 days later, summoned by reports of indigenous anti-armor capability that had somehow materialized without official procurement channels. They found Esteban in his workshop, fabricating the 3rd launcher, surrounded by bamboo sections and propellant calculations, and the controlled chaos of improvised weapons development. Corporal Valdez, the senior officer, a captain with engineering corps insignia, studied the half-completed launcher with the expression of someone discovering their physics textbooks were incomplete. "Sir, we'd like to examine your weapon." "Which one, sir?" "All of them, starting with the one you used against the Japanese landing craft." Esteban retrieved the original launcher from where it rested against the cave wall. The bamboo showed scorch marks and stress fractures, but the structure remained intact. He handed it to the American captain, who accepted it with visible uncertainty about how to hold something that looked like a fishing pole crossed with a pipe bomb. "This is bamboo," the captain said. "Bambusa blumeana, sir. Compressive strength of approximately 8,000 PS1 when properly treated. And this destroyed an armored landing craft." "Yes, sir." "With 1 shot?" "Yes, sir." The captain set the launcher down very carefully, as if worried it might spontaneously detonate. "Can you build more?" "I'm currently fabricating production models, sir. The design has been refined based on field testing. Estimated output is 12 units per week, with available materials." 12 per week. The captain made notes on a clipboard. Range? Effective range against static targets is approximately 250 meters. Accuracy degrades beyond that due to projectile instability. Rate of fire? Single shot, disposable. Reload time is impractical under combat conditions. So you get 1 shot. "Yes, sir. But 1 shot is frequently sufficient against unarmored or lightly armored targets." The captain continued making notes, occasionally glancing at the launcher like it might attack him. Finally, he looked up. "The brass is very interested in this, Corporal. Very interested. They're discussing official procurement, possibly expanding production, integrating the design into standard guerrilla operations." Esteban nodded, unsure whether official interest represented vindication or interference. The weapon worked because it was simple, improvised, built with available materials by someone who understood local conditions. Institutional involvement might improve production capacity, but would inevitably complicate design philosophy. "I'm also authorized to inform you," the captain continued, "that you're being recommended for commendation, Silver Star, pending review, for innovation under combat conditions and extraordinary initiative in developing indigenous weapon systems." "That's unnecessary, sir. It's also non-negotiable. You've given guerrilla forces throughout the theater a viable anti-armor capability. The implications are significant. I built a bamboo tube that shoots artillery shells, sir. The mathematics aren't complicated. The mathematics might not be, but the execution is. Shit, you've essentially created a man-portable, recoilless rifle using salvaged materials and pre-industrial fabrication techniques. That's not just innovation. That's genius. It's applied physics, sir. Valdez, can you please stop being humble and accept that you did something remarkable? I solved a tactical problem using available resources, sir. That's standard operating procedure for guerrilla warfare. The captain smiled, the expression of someone recognizing stubbornness, disguised as modesty. Standard operating procedure doesn't usually involve inventing new weapon categories, but have it your way. He handed Esteban a requisition form. Material requirements. List everything you need for expanded production. The Army will source it, within reason. Define reason, sir. Anything that doesn't require shipping a factory. So think pragmatic, not perfect. Over the following weeks, Esteban's workshop transformed from a cave operation into something approaching a small manufacturing facility. American supply drops included steel reinforcement bands, proper percussion caps, standardized propellant charges. Esteban trained other guerrillas in fabrication techniques. The launchers proliferated across Leyte's guerrilla network, each one carrying a variation of the same basic design. Bamboo tube, steel reinforcement, propellant charge, artillery shell, improvised firing mechanism. By January 1945, the weapons had acquired official nomenclature in American intelligence reports. Improvised anti-boat launcher, Type 5, the V standing for Valdez. The designation never appeared in official procurement documents because the weapons weren't officially procured. But everyone called them Valdez launchers, and the name stuck. The Japanese, facing increasing numbers of these weapons along coastlines they'd previously controlled, began altering landing procedures, approaching at night, using multiple diversionary boats, establishing suppressive fire before beaching. But improvisation counters adaptation. Guerrillas learned to wait, to fire from concealment, to target the most vulnerable vessels. The tactical advantage shifted, not decisively. The war in Leyte remained brutal, contested, expensive in lives and resources. But the guerrillas gained capabilities they'd previously lacked. Japanese landing operations became riskier, more complicated, less predictable. The calculus of coastal control changed. Esteban continued fabricating launchers, training operators, refining designs based on field reports. But he worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd discovered his purpose wasn't following orders, but solving problems that orders couldn't address. Captain Salazar, watching this transformation, made a note in his official report. Corporal Valdez represents the future of guerrilla warfare, adaptive, innovative, unwilling to accept institutional limitations. Recommend immediate promotion and expanded responsibilities. The promotion came through in February. Sergeant Esteban Valdez, attached to the U.S. Army Special Services Group, acting liaison for indigenous weapons development. The Silver Star followed in March, presented during a brief ceremony in Tacloban City by an American general who admitted he didn't entirely understand how the weapon worked, but deeply appreciated that it did. And Esteban accepted both with the same quiet competence he brought to fabricating launchers. Acknowledgement without ego, recognition that the work mattered more than the awards. The war ended in August 1945. The launchers, by then, had proliferated throughout the Philippine guerrilla network, modified and improved by dozens of fabricators working from Esteban's basic principles. Estimates suggest approximately 300 were built before the Japanese surrender, accounting for significant Japanese casualties and operational disruptions. Esteban Valdez returned to Tacloban City, declining offers to join American military engineering programs or attend formal schooling in the United States. He reopened his uncle's metalworking shop, fabricating agricultural equipment and repairing fishing boat engines, and the same work he'd done before the war. But people remembered. The veterans remembered Corporal Valdez, who'd built a weapon from bamboo and mathematics, and proven that genius operates independent of institutional validation. The Americans remembered the guerrilla sergeant, who'd created an entire weapons category using salvaged materials and pre-war physics textbooks. The Japanese remembered, in their casualty reports, the strange rocket launcher weapons that appeared along coastlines they'd considered secure. Esteban himself rarely discussed the war. When pressed, he'd explain the launcher's principles, compression ratios, propellant burn rates, projectile stability, with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to discussing engine repair. The heroism, the legend, the recognition, those were external constructions. Yet he'd solved problems. The problems required unusual solutions. The solutions worked. That was enough. In 1952, a journalist visited Tacloban, researching stories of Philippine resistance fighters. He found Esteban in the metalworking shop, teaching an apprentice how to properly weld steel joints. "They say you invented a weapon that changed guerrilla warfare," the journalist said. Esteban wiped his hands on an oil rag, considering the statement. "I built a tube that launched projectiles," he said. "Other people made it significant. But you proved that improvisation could match institutional resources. I proved that mathematics works regardless of who understands it." The Japanese had better training, better equipment, better logistics. But they couldn't invalidate physics. Neither could the Americans. Neither could I. And I just applied principles that existed long before the war and will exist long after. Is that modesty or accuracy? It's both. Modesty would be denying I did anything noteworthy. Accuracy is acknowledging that what I did was apply existing knowledge to immediate problems. The noteworthy part was recognizing that official approval wasn't required for tactical innovation. The journalist took notes, sensing this perspective mattered more than the dramatic stories other veterans told. "What do you want people to remember?" Esteban thought for a long moment, watching his apprentice struggle with a difficult weld. "That genius doesn't require credentials," he finally said. "It requires curiosity, observation, and willingness to test assumptions." The war taught me that institutions value conformity over innovation, right up until innovation becomes strategically necessary. Then suddenly, everyone wants to claim credit for the heretic's idea. You sound bitter. I sound experienced. There's a difference. The journalist's article, published months later, carried the headline, "The Bamboo Gunsmith: How One Filipino Corporal Changed Guerrilla Warfare." It circulated widely, cementing Esteban's place in military history, alongside innovators who'd operated outside formal systems. Esteban read the article once, noted several technical inaccuracies, and returned to his work. He died in 1983, age 67, still running the metalworking shop, still teaching apprentices, still believing that problems required solutions more than recognition. And the Philippine government awarded him posthumous recognition as a national hero. American military historians included his launchers in textbooks on improvised weapons and guerrilla warfare. Museums displayed surviving examples with plaques explaining their significance. But perhaps the most fitting memorial appeared in guerrilla training manuals used decades after the war in conflicts throughout Asia and beyond. The manuals, teaching soldiers to fight with minimal resources, invariably included a section on improvised launchers. The designs varied: PVC pipe, steel tubing, fiberglass, but the principles remained constant: controlled explosion, appropriate projectile, reliable triggering mechanism. The footnote read, based on techniques pioneered by Sergeant Esteban Valdez, Philippine Commonwealth Army, 1944. His technique was simple, but his legend endures. And no one who understood physics ever doubted him again.